And now let's move to that supplementary report, which is item 17, the Water Supply Programme Update. So Helen, welcome to the table. Thank you very much indeed for preparing this report, and we'll invite you to speak to it in just a moment. I mean, this obviously is an update on the resolutions that we passed back in April, where we raised a clear expectation that the chlorination of the water supply would be for 12 months. Any extension of that would require a further council resolution. It's great to have this paper in front of us today, showing us the work that you're doing towards reducing the amount of chlorine in the water supply, and obviously turning the chlorine off at certain pump stations, and what the programme looks like to reduce the amount of chlorine and get more and more unchlorinated water into the network as we go. So I'll hand over to you to speak to the report, but thank you very much indeed for providing this detailed information to us today. Thank you.
Thank you. So we do have an update on the Water Supply Improvement Programme, and we are planning and doing at the same time. So some of this is an update on stuff that is done, some of it is an update on work in progress, and some of it is an update on where we are with our planning, and we're still exploring other options. So some of the report probably raises more questions than answers. So in terms of maximising the delivery of untreated water, we have moved from 5% of the supply, and we expect to have 24% of the supply without chlorine treatment by the end of August. So that's from the 4 pump stations out of our 53, the 4 pump stations that are permanently without chlorine, and another 7 where we can deliver to winter demand levels by isolating the one below ground wellhead and maximising the delivery from the secure above ground wellheads. So that's the reducing chlorine across the city. We've also got the first tranche of major remedial works underway, so that's at another 7 pump stations, and some of those overlap the ones where we've temporarily isolated, so it's hard to keep track of the numbers, but that first tranche of works delivers about 17% of our supply, and once those works are completed, those will be permanently without chlorine as well. The second tranche of works is some 17 pump stations, 49 wells across the city, and that's where the indicative timelines for that work begin in February next year and run out to 2020. So that is where the timelines are quite challenging in terms of the major remedial works. We've outlined in the paper some things that we're doing to try and advance those works. The first is to get more drilling rigs and specialist contractors on board. That may or may not help, because it really, one of the biggest constraints is the number of wells that we can turn off at any one time, and that's where we've talked about water conservation. A second possibility is to do some interim remedial works to some of the below ground wellheads that are in quite good condition, and get sign off on those and defer the major remedial works and the raising of those above ground to further out, so 2 or 3 years out. Another possibility is rolling out more ultraviolet treatment. So we'll bring you a paper 23rd of August council meeting on ultraviolet treatment for main pumps, and that remains an option for some of our other larger pump stations around the city, and we'll have a look at that. And another thing that we're doing as we're doing works on the pump stations is where we suspect that some of our pump stations could actually deliver more water, we're doing some step testing of those wells, and it may be that we can deliver more water from some of our pump stations and by upgrading some of the pumps there. So that's another option. The other aspect of the work is the research that we commissioned into international experience, and you've got that full report there, and that clearly demonstrates that chlorination is no silver bullet in terms of public safety. So the experience in Western Europe, and particularly in the Netherlands, where 85% of their supplies are without chlorine, shows that you can get very good public health outcomes. They have rates of waterborne disease that are 4 or 5 times lower than in the United Kingdom or in the United States, where chlorination is mandatory. So it's good to see that it is possible. So just reminding you that you will get another report on the 23rd of August on the ultraviolet disinfection at main pumps, and you can expect another report on those tranche 2 works and some real timelines, given exploring all of those other aspects to accelerate it in October. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll move to questions. Phil.
Helen, thank you very much for your report. It's very full and clearly backed up with the other reports. But your point about the chlorination not being a silver bullet, and you refer to that in your report. So I'm just wondering, given that's the case, that in fact, from the report, protozoa, people wouldn't be protected from the protozoa, say. I'm just really wondering why the Havelock North report supported so much chlorination as sort of like a primary defence.
So chlorination is an effective barrier to bacteria and other pathogens in the water supply. It's just not the only barrier. So there are other barriers that can be used in combination and still get those public health outcomes.
And I guess one of the other ones you're going to give us more information on in the next report is the UV.
Yes. Yeah. So that will come to you 23rd of August.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Glenn.
Thank you, Helen. And on the same theme that Phil's just asked, so for those who haven't got the report or access to it today, what are the main barriers aside from chlorination used in those European countries? Because we know that this is about barriers, of which chlorination is one.
Yeah.
There's a sense in which we are putting, or perhaps New Zealand, all the eggs into one basket.
So the, I think that New Zealand, the current drinking water standards do talk about a multi-barrier approach, and the key principle really coming out of the Havelock North report is that you should have a very high standard of care and vigilance about any public water supply. And then they go on to talk about a multi-barrier approach. They do regard chlorination as essential within that multi-barrier approach, but I think that international experience says that it isn't necessarily so. Well, it is one barrier, it's not necessarily an essential one. So in terms of the Dutch approach, the first thing is making sure you've got very good source water, and they favour groundwater over surface water because it's generally a safer and cleaner water source. And indeed, that is one of the criterion for a secure bore status here, is that we have good source water and that we constantly monitor that and know that it's good. Then the second part, of course, is in your headworks, so having that secure borehead and the works that we're doing to improve ours, and then looking through your whole network, so ensuring that you maintain and run your network very well indeed, and that you have very tight control of any repairs or maintenance procedures. So when you're taking things offline and putting them back, that you're very clear that you're not introducing contamination when you're doing that.
Thank you, Pauline.
That's following on from that, and thank you. Really good report, Helen. I've just made a note here that looking at the Dutch practices, and they've quoted in one of these reports that chemical treatment should be kept to a minimum, and that's what they believe. But they do have a higher cost for delivery, they have lower leakage, and lower transgression rates. Now my question is, lower transgression rates than what? Is that comparing to New Zealand or the rest of the world?
Compared to New Zealand and the rest of the world, yes.
But Christchurch, we haven't had any transgression rates as far as I know.
We have had transgressions in our reticulation. Yes, we have. So generally at our reservoirs, it's the main place where we have E. coli transgressions.
So we haven't had any major transgressions. I mean, how many have we had?
No, we haven't had any recorded outbreaks of waterborne disease either from our networks. But we do get the occasional E. coli transgression in our network, and those rates are higher than experienced in the Netherlands.
Well, I've never seen any figures on those transgression rates, and John Mackey's constantly told us at the ITI committee that we haven't had any transgression rates in life. Small numbers, yeah. So is it possible
So
to get
Dave Adamson may wish to comment on that.
We've got a water safety plan which is approved by the Medical Officer of Health, which talks about that transgression. We do get minor transgressions. I think the major ones really that are happening around the reservoirs, and so we will do an operations there, and we've been sealing our reservoirs. We're doing you've spent a lot of money on doing that kind of work. The transgressions are reported. You will see them reported in the quarterly or the 2-monthly report with John, but they're normally one. You know, they are absolutely at the low end. We chlorinate, we retest 24 hours later and they've gone. So they are a little blip, but in actual fact, our water safety plan says we will move very, very quickly on even the little blips. So, you know, they're not big, but they are constantly there. And as Helen says, they're principally in the reticulation. But they could be where someone's dug through a reticulation one, through a bit of reticulation and dirt's gone in, all sorts of things like that. You'll always get some minor discretions within the reticulation system. Yeah.
Thank you.
So just to reinforce that, they have been minor
Yes,
and not numerous.
that's correct.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. Raf, Vicky, and then Aaron. Raf.
Yeah, thank you. Helen, I refer to item 5.42.5 on page 13, where it says, since the Canterbury earthquakes and until December 2017, the city's water supply had a provisionally secure status and complied with the drinking water standards without the need for treatment. 22nd of August 2017, the annual compliance report was received from the drinking water assessor confirming that the Christchurch water supply was compliant with the drinking water standards at that time. That changed, obviously, in December when the Director General issued a loss of secure water status. I guess my question is, we were quite happy with the water supply at that time. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, that would be fair to say.
So the reason that we've chlorinated is because we were facing a compliance certificate from the Medical Officer of Health, not because we suddenly were worried about our water supply.
We had the regular annual inspection of the wellheads, and that inspection came back saying that they would not be signed off as secure.
Yeah, but until that point, we were not concerned about the state of the wellheads or the water supply.
I might ask Dave Adamson to come to the table if we're going to go back in time.
Council had a program of updating wellheads that kicked in, look, I'm sorry, I'm not sure, about 2011, I think, where we were raising all of our below-ground wellheads to above-ground wellheads. We had a very, very extensive monitoring program over the quality of water coming out of all of our wellheads, as well as in the reticulation. So we've got a multi-faceted supply. We were not getting transgressions out of any of our wellheads, and so we were, and you were, we were advising and we were putting money into looking after the breakage in our reticulation. We were looking at upgrading our wellheads, sorry, not our wellheads, our reservoirs, because we believe we were getting ingress from birds and things like that came and sat, because a lot of our big concrete reservoirs had cracked. You actually replaced quite a significant amount of them. So we were putting our effort, our concerns at that time were on reticulation and on reservoirs, yes, and that's really where we were putting our effort. So at that time, we also had...
Just stop you, just going back to the actual question.
Yeah.
We did not have any concern about our water supply.
We had no concern about the quality of water coming out of our wellheads, and our upgrade program, as you said, with that report that came from the drinking, had been shared with the Medical Officer of Health. So we had an improvement program that incorporated the slow upgrade of our wellheads, and that improvement program was agreed by all parties as at the end of June, really. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And things changed, obviously, from the second report from Havelock North.
Thank you. Vicky, and then Aaron. Vicky.
Mine's to you, Dave, and concerns the 5.44 in terms of the current review of the three water sector being led by the Department of Internal Affairs, who I rang this morning just because, having read all their data, what concerned me was that they were actually putting the cost of the drinking water, wastewater and stormwater from the small local authorities who face a massive bill onto urban areas. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the model that they've provided of Christchurch being linked with these possibilities, do we know anything about the cost of, for example, 2/3 of the South Island in terms of bringing its drinking water, wastewater and stormwater up to speed, and which they would like to put on to the good people of Christchurch?
I would say the Department of Internal Affairs sees cost as being quite a large barrier. Now, there has been some work done by the Water Managers Group that's gone up to the Chief Executives Group, which I'm not sure whether it's gone on to the Mayoral Group, looking at the Canterbury costs, but not looking at the bigger South Island costs as far as I know.
Perhaps I can comment on that. So no, it hasn't gone to the Mayoral Forum. It was really just a stock take. The information is included in each council's long-term plan. Not all councils have budgeted for an increased cost over and above their general maintenance.
So they haven't even budgeted to get their water up to standard?
Not well, because they don't know what the standard is going to be.
Right.
So it varies across the various councils.
Right. Great. I'll have more to say about that when we debate. Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. Aaron.
Yeah, thanks Helen. Now just a little bit of a follow-on from Vicky's point around that regional usage, because when we look at the recommendations that have gone to government following Havelock North, and like Rav said, we had no concerns about our water supply. Pauline had raised that no one's ever been sick from Christchurch's potable water supply, and that was confirmed by Alistair Humphreys. That we're kind of like, this feels like throwing the baby out with the drinking water by putting the whole country in the same basket. And when you look at on page 5.44, the maps, of the purple one of the top half of the South Island, or even the one that covers most of Canterbury, if that is to come in, would you go to the lowest common denominator, in which case would end up being chlorinated, because out in Darfield they're pulling from wells and they have transgressions all the time, or various areas around Canterbury? Does that then force us into chlorination rather than staying independent, drinking the best drinking water in the world, and not treating it like other parts of the country?
I think there are two separate but related processes going on here. So one is the Department of Internal Affairs review of the delivery of 3 water services across the country, and there is no doubt that there are problems with the delivery of those services and the quality of those services across the country, particularly in small centres. So that is one piece of work. And then the related piece of work is the Ministry of Health work looking at the response to the Havelock North Inquiry Stage 2 report. And it's that work that is talking about setting up an independent drinking regulator. So it's a regulator, not a delivery model. And that regulator would be the one setting what the drinking water standards would be. Now, I'm pretty sure that the drinking water standards will continue to take a risk-based approach, and that something as prescriptive as chlorination is likely to be in the context of that risk-based approach. So it would depend on what the issues are for each supply, and it wouldn't be a blanket requirement to do any one thing for every supply in the country.
But currently, that is one of the recommendations, is to chlorinate the whole country.
There is a recommendation for mandatory chlorination, but they do also discuss the what the threshold should be for any exemptions. And if you look at the Cabinet paper in response to that inquiry, which is where you have to look for what the government thinking is, they are asking for further advice on that. So they're not saying, okay, we're going to do this, tell us how we should do it. They're saying, give us further advice on the issue of mandatory chlorination.
So if you're going to go independent, then that flies in the face of 5.44, because if you went across even just all of Canterbury, which is one of the models, or 2/3 of the South Island, as Vicky called it, which is pretty close, then there's no point in treating them separately when they're all the same.
So at the moment around the country we already have shared services models and council-controlled organisations that deliver numerous water supplies. They don't all use the same treatment for the same source and community. So for some source waters and communities, there will be one set of treatment processes. For a different source water, a different reticulation in a different community, they will use another approach, because the type of treatment that you use and the system of barriers that you need depends on the quality of your source water and then the quality of your reticulation.
Right.
So just because you have one organisation delivering multiple community supplies doesn't mean that you do exactly the same treatment system for those supplies. So the governance and management arrangements are different to the technical treatment arrangements.
And just my final question then is, if this model is to come in, or something similar to, because I know it's been discussed at the Mayoral Forum and so on and so forth, given we're still some form of a democracy, will the people actually have the option to have a say on it? Not just a consultation, but will there be an actual vote where the people of Christchurch can say, you know what, we want to be completely independent, drink our own water, treat our own water the way we want to treat it, or not?
And that's a question for the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta and David Clark.
So just to clarify that, if I may, I ran Internal Affairs this morning because I was concerned about that. I think it's important that we understand what's going on, but I won't if you don't want me to.
Okay, there'll be the opportunity to talk about the conversation you had with Internal Affairs during debate if you wanted to. I'll come to a question from Dion.
Well, actually, I think my question's following on. I've got similar concerns. In in 5.43, you mentioned that in this report, it states that the principle of public ownership of existing infrastructure will underpin the reforms that the local government will, and that local government will continue to be involved in the considerations of the new models. But then in 5.44, it says current examples in New Zealand are Watercare in Auckland and Wellington Water, which are companies. Yes, their shareholders are councils, but they have independent boards. So the worry that I have and the question that I have is this, or do you see what they're proposing and what you've written in these 2 points, is that actually a company will dictate to councils what's going to happen, and then that councils and public people, such as all the ratepayers, will have to pay for it?
I think there are a lot of conversations that will be taking place between local government and central government before any of this is put in place.
But do you think from, I mean, that's, I'm reading between the lines of what's been written in our report that people can see.
Can I just say, I don't think that's fair to ask our staff what government might be thinking and what the implications of that will be. But Helen's right in that there needs to be a whole lot of conversations with central government. They may well come and dictate what happens, they may not.
It's quite revolting.
Yeah, I mean, this is all a matter for government.
Yeah, I think that's part of your debate is that, but I think asking our staff.
No, I mean, I'm just asking because it's been written in this report.
Yeah,
but so I just wanted to get a bit of clarification around that.
What it's doing is quoting the Minister and the review so far from the DIA. It's alerting you to that.
Yeah,
yeah, it is.
So these paragraphs really are just stating the situation as it currently stands. Obviously, there's some decision making that needs to occur within government. We would hope that local government would have some influence over that decision making. To what extent that'll be the case remains to be seen. But I mean, certainly the Minister has made some comments, not least at the recent Local Government New Zealand conference here in Christchurch, that suggest quite strongly what her view might be.
And we will continue to speak with the staff from Department of Internal Affairs and from the Ministry of Health and make sure they understand the situation here in Christchurch and what we're doing.
So you are aware of that and are quite strong on the opinion.
And there are two different conversations, of course, one of which is an officials to officials conversation and the other of which is a political conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Indeed. Are there any further questions on the report as it's in front of us today? Mike.
Yeah, I had several questions, Andrew.
And then I'll come to Yanni. Yep, Mike.
Thank you.
That's similar to the costs at the Gardeners Pump Station, yes. So that was for developing new wells. So there's quite a lot of more work in developing a new well than there is in remediating an existing well.
Okay. And the other one, on 5.10, you talk about that the north-west zone will soon be at 64%. So is there a point in time where that zone can be at 100% for the rest of the city? And if so, do you know when that roughly will be?
Yes, the northwest zone is likely to be at 100% before the rest of the city. Do I have a timetable for when it's likely to be? No, I don't. We're doing some further modelling work, and particularly around that step testing of the pump stations to see if we can deliver more water from the secure pump stations. So until we've done that modelling work, we can't really set out the timelines for it.
Do you have a rough idea, therefore, when we'd get a better idea of the timeline for the northwest zone?
We should have that in the October report.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yanni, we'll come to your questions.
Great, thank you. I put a number of questions through to the briefing, which I haven't received responses back on. So I'll get to those in a minute. But at a very high level, I've also circulated a paper that was written post-earthquake, and it was basically around looking at having smaller water supply zones. And I just wondered if the staff could just give us some sense of our current water supply strategy and how the work is related to the strategic approach that we're taking as a city, because I don't see reference to our water supply strategy in this report. I don't see reference to the document or the report that was written by staff and I think a consultant post-earthquake around moving towards smaller water supply zones. So I'd be really interested to know, from that wider strategic point of view, how the work that is being proposed and is being done fits into that. Thank you. That's the first question.
We are doing quite a bit of work around downstream effect from wellheads, really. The work that Helen's doing is around wellheads, and we're now looking at reticulation, particularly if you have a look at the report that got presented giving the European or the Dutch and the German experience, showing the low levels of leakage from their network compared to our own. We believe that if we go down that track might lead us into an ability to isolate zones and also better measure flow going in and out of those zones so that we can get a far more accurate. That's a piece of work that's being done at the moment. It's quite difficult for us to come up, however, with a strategic document when there's so much unknown up in the air with central government. Now, we believe that there may be a report back to Cabinet in August, there might be another one in September, and there may be a follow-up report in October, but really the main decisions we don't think will happen until the middle of next year, potentially. But we are doing some work around that and around our strategy, around zoning, around our reticulation, around, you will have recognised we're doing a bit of work around pressure zones as well, which all feed in to that same picture. So there is work being done on that. However, we're not in a position really to recommend anything because we're such in a state of flux at the moment.
So just in terms of the work that we're currently doing, have we looked at where it's logical, if we wanted to go to smaller water supply zones, installing the equipment at the same time, rather than having to come back and spend more money on contractors and consultants further down the track?
The work we're doing on wellheads doesn't really affect the way we zone manage our supply, and as Helen says, we're doing quite a lot of modelling through our network, and the zones change depending on the time of the day and the time of the year, and basically whether you've got big industries. You know, a good example would be industry pulls a lot of water from 8 till maybe 5 or even longer than that during the day. Households pull a lot of water during early morning and night, and so the zones are shifting. We're doing a lot of modelling around exactly where that water flows, but I couldn't guarantee anyone who and where they got their water from, but the management of the zones is almost, well, is work that's independent of the work that we're doing on the wellheads at this stage.
Thank you. And just the final question related to the water supply strategy is, it was supposed to be reviewed in 2014. I don't believe it has been reviewed. Can you just advise where the current review is at, if it's been commenced, if it's what the timeframe is for that?
So we do have a draft, a working draft of the integrated water strategy, which takes into, well, it combines the wastewater strategy, the water supply strategy and the surface water strategy that we currently have as 3 separate documents. That draft has been on hold while we've been working with Ngāi Tahu over the stormwater consent. Now that the stormwater consent is back on track, if you like, and has been it's been relodged, hasn't it, and notified again with Environment Canterbury, we've picked up that draft and we're arranging workshops with the local iwi groups, and that will come up to council. As part of that, we will then have a water supply implementation plan, and we've begun work on that already, so that will be part of that water supply strategy.
So is it correct to say that it will be 10 years since we've reviewed it by the time we get around to reviewing it?
Sorry, I'm not sure what the original date was, but we've been doing quite a lot of work, obviously, around earthquake damage that we've had and state of flux. As Helen says, the comprehensive stormwater consent has probably been in train for the last 4 years, so it's a significant piece of work, as has the new regional land and water plan, which has also had quite a big impact, not only on our stormwater consent, but the way we will manage all of our surface water issues. So there has been work been going on in the background, but yes, it hasn't really surfaced at this point at a council level, because basically we're still pulling all the threads together to actually give you that integrated approach. And we believe an integrated approach is the right way to go, because they have all got interrelationships with each other.
Okay, thank you. Now, just the specific questions that I put through to the briefing as well, are you able just to respond to those, or would you like me to go through them again so you've got them?
So there are questions that have been put through as written questions. Is that right, Yanni?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, and have you
Yes.
received a response to those?
No, I have not.
You haven't.
So just, I mean, I'll just go through them. They're pretty quick, but one was just, I know that Selwyn and Waimak councils obviously have water supplies signed off as secure by the DWA, and I was just wondering what examination we've given to the assessment that's been done of their wellheads and who their contractors are, and whether there's anything that we can learn from what they're doing.
We are certainly working with our consultants and contractors and looking at the experience in other local authorities. In particular, we're looking at Napier. I'm not aware that we've specifically looked at Selwyn and Waimak, but certainly we are looking at Napier, where they have a similar secure groundwater supply and have not been chlorinating that supply in the past. So yes, we are learning from other territorial authorities.
Okay, and do we have any sense of that we're being treated the same as they have in terms of the assessment by the engineers, in terms of the standard of our wellheads?
My impression is that the engineers right across the country have a very similar interpretation. You will appreciate we got the assessment of our wellheads peer reviewed, and there was slightly changed, but we did look at that. So we believe that engineers right across the country are really interpreting the drinking water standards to the same, reasonably same level, which is a marked shift from where it was probably 12 months ago. There's also obviously a shift where we could do work in an improvement plan, and that was fine. There was an improvement plan, as was raised by earlier in the discussion, but that's now, we have to deliver that plan, and that's really what Helen's doing, and you have fast track through the LTP.
Okay, and just two final questions. One is, what confidence can we have in City Care doing further work, given that they were involved in the ongoing maintenance of the wellheads? That is part of the reason why we got to this situation?
I don't think that that's a fair analysis of maybe the situation. However, we are working very closely with City Care in partnership to make sure that what we have got in our maintenance contracts gets delivered, gets monitored. They've got a whole range of online systems that we are now looking at
They're doing regular monitoring of all the chlorination, all the temporary works. So it'd be fair to say that the water staff are working in close partnership with City Care at the moment to deliver the outcome that we were expecting.
Right, and we have confidence in City Care?
We've got a contract with them that we need to maintain, so we are looking and ensuring that we're getting what we're asking to be delivered to a quality that we are being delivered, so that is occurring.
Right, and just the final question was in regards to just the social and the community initiatives. Have we done any more work on the distribution of water filters, filling containers from service centres at libraries, and also a map and a location of collection points for non-chlorinated water? I just don't see much consideration of the social and health impacts around the chlorination in our communities, and I just wondered if there's been any progress in regards to those issues that have previously been raised, but I haven't seen much progress.
We have expanded the information available to the general public, so the website has been upgraded and expanded. We now have a map that shows clearly where the chlorination has been reduced or removed right across the city, and we're getting very high counts of people going to see that map, and we're also distributing that information through social media. So there is certainly anecdotally a lot of social connection across the city where people are going to collect their water from someone else's house if they're close to a pump station that still has chlorine and they have friends who do not. So I think that as we reduce the chlorine levels across the city, there is much less of a problem with that, and certainly the number of taste and odour complaints has dropped dramatically. So we have much fewer complaints across the city now.
Right, so just so I'm clear, we are not going to do any work around providing a location for people to get untreated, non-chlorinated water.
We certainly
that works nothing.
We haven't designated a tap where you can drive up, but there's very clear information showing where the pump stations are that have no chlorine.
But people can't just walk up and access that, can they? They have to know someone in the area. They have to hope that that person's not connected to another water supply that is getting chlorine. Yeah, maybe we could get some more information back on that. But, you know, I guess I am a little bit frustrated that this has repeatedly been raised, have been told that this has been worked on, and we don't see any progress.
There have been a number of reports.
I'm happy to say.
Sorry, there has been a number of reports gone up to council around the issues of supplying that water, but we are still working on some of it. You did also raise the issue about filters, and I might just ask Ross, because we have, you know, you put a filter in, it still needs to be maintained, and so that's one of the real issues about getting that information as part of our network as well, so that you actually, just because you put a filter in doesn't necessarily mean it's going to last forever, and so there are certain quantity of water, because we did look at that at one stage of putting filters in, and we did provide you with a memo about filters into some of our libraries, but the costs and the maintenance and the need to get industrial size filters was just going to be pretty horrific.
All right,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Yanni, that's everything from you?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Sarah.
Thank you. Just two things, one on the report and one actually, I'd just like you to, if you're able to comment on the copper-silver ionisation option presented by the deputation today.
We'll have a look at that. I have two comments. One is that we are looking at minimising chemical treatment. So that is an alternative chemical treatment rather than having either no treatment or something like ultraviolet, which has no residual. So that would put a residual into the reticulation. And copper and silver levels are controlled through the New Zealand Drinking Water Standards. My understanding of the levels that are required for disinfection are that they're below the maximum acceptable value, so it would comply with that. But we would also need to look at making sure that any new and innovative treatment that isn't listed in the drinking water standards is accepted by the drinking water assessor and the medical officer of health. And that might be quite a process, as well as looking at the costs. Copper and silver are not cheap.
Okay, thanks. So back to the report. So we've got, by the end of the month, hopefully 24% of the water being untreated.
It would be at least 24%.
At least 24%.
So when we do the percentages for you, what we're doing is we're looking at what it would be looking over a whole year.
Yep.
So in the winter time, it'll be much greater because
Yep.
we'll favour those pump stations.
Yep. And 5% sort of to start with anyway.
Yes.
Because there were some that didn't need the chlorination to start with.
That's correct.
So we'll have a number of pumps where we installed what turned out to be relatively expensive temporary chlorination equipment that has ended up being used for only a couple of months, or so maybe for some of them less than 4 months. And I'm wondering how much we've ended up spending on temporary equipment that actually hasn't been used for very long.
So that equipment isn't being discarded.
No.
So that equipment is being cleaned down and held for if it may be needed over the summer period, or if it may be needed in another application.
Okay, yeah. But at this point we've had chlorination in some of the pumps for a very short period of time, and when, as Raf was pointing out earlier, the risk actually hadn't changed at all since the paperwork had changed.
That's correct. So temporary chlorination has been an expensive exercise, and there's no evidence that we've got improved public health outcomes from it.
That's right.
Thank you. Any further questions? Jimmy.
I'm concerned is regarding to the water conservation campaign, because based on information, but I didn't see any incentive scheme, whether can encourage people fully understand a moment is a kind of the extraordinary time period, whether each one like to, really need to save in the water consumption. But I didn't see any kind of the scheme for the incentive.
So we haven't yet scoped what the water conservation campaign will be over the summer. What we're doing is saying that if we want to continue with works through the summer period, we will need an effective water conservation campaign, and we're going to start by doing a survey to determine what the appetite for a water conservation campaign would be and what types of measures people would be happy to roll out across the city. So we'd like to do that work first and then put in place a water conservation campaign over that summer period.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, back to you.
And just on that, the framing of that's going to be really important, because of course we're going to have a whole section of the city who won't see as much of a reason to do it because they'll have an unchlorinated water supply. And so actually the framing around that will be, I think, quite important as, for the good of the city, because many people will be unchlorinated by then.
That's correct. The sad news for the people who will be unchlorinated by then is that if the demand goes up right across the city, then we'll be pushing water across the city. That
so I think framing that really clearly will be really important, getting the information across.
All right, Aaron, you've got a question?
Yeah, it's just in addition to that, around that messaging, and that is that Christchurch sees itself as quite an environmentally friendly place. Yet last summer, on the first weekend of December, we used the most water in the world per person. And we need to be, I don't think we're aware enough of that. We don't look at that. We don't look at how much water that is, like 650 litres of water for every single person in the city in a day is an incredible amount when it's drinking water quality, it's bottled water quality.
So this is leading to a question?
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on. We're done with questions, yep? Okay, great. So can I have a mover for so Vicky?
No, I want to move an additional motion.
Right, so you want to move what's in front of us with an additional motion attached as well?
Yeah, if you could put it up.
Yep, thank you. To make it very clear to the Department of Internal Affairs that the Council is totally opposed to being part of a water company or authority which goes beyond Christchurch City and means that water is not a function of a directly elected authority, and our residents have been required to pay for the cost of remediation, drinking water, stormwater or wastewater for rural and small urban authorities in the South Island.
So where will that come from? Officials or governance?
Sorry?
Officials or governance, making it very clear.
I think governance.
Yep.
Do we ask the Mayor to write a letter perhaps to the Department of Internal
No, I
Affairs?
think I've actually invited, if I may speak now.
Yep, so we've got a mover for this, Vicky. Have we got a seconder? Dion. Okay, so Vicky, you're indicating you'd like to engage in debate.
Yes,
Great.
I would. Just in relation to, and I realise I've got a short time, so I just want to focus on that part that is around 5.44 and 5.55 and 5.546, which talks about changes in the way in which the three waters are managed. And if you read through the Internal Affairs Department documents that sit with it and the Minister's speeches, it is absolutely clear that they are faced with major issues in relation to the quality of drinking water, stormwater and wastewater in local authorities across the country, especially small local authorities. And when you read their papers, it looks as though let's solve that by making much larger areas for those three water authorities and actually making sure that the cities pay for the rural wastewater, stormwater and drinking water, where they have very few staff, very few resources, and in the South Island, especially around Canterbury, very major problems. So we're sorting out our water, making sure that all aspects of it are at the highest possible standard, and then post-October this year, there are two things coming to Cabinet. One is the regulatory, and then there is this structure that is being created. If you look at our budget from last year, 40% of our OPEX goes into water, wastewater, stormwater. So if you take that out of the Christchurch City Council, you actually decimate a huge chunk of what we do. Of our CapEx, it's slightly less, it's 28%, and overall of our budget, 34.25% this year goes into those three waters. That is a massive chunk of this council. No matter what happens in water, the people of Christchurch, who have a very strong emotional attachment to all aspects of water, need to be able to go to a directly elected authority, not a company that we've appointed, not a regional authority, not a standalone thing, no company, nothing. It needs to be a directly elected authority to which they can go and tell the fact that they are angry or happy or whatever. So what we are getting into with this suggestion, and I mean the two suggestions that you've got in front of you are for, and these are not definite yet, but I think we need to be very clear about where we stand. I spoke to the Department of Internal Affairs this morning and have invited him to come and speak to all councillors because we haven't all had the same information at the same time. So he's organising that through the Mayor's Department now, and I think that's really important. But if we are going to take, you know that what's coming at the smaller rural authorities who have had massive issues with water, who have major lakes to sort out, the point of what this is, and you don't need to read between the lines, it's actually in the lines of the documents from a DIA, is that that cost will be shared by the city. So bad news, Christchurch ratepayers, because you've got an earthquake and the government promised that they would bring you back up to speed and they forgot to do that. And then you've got an issue of small rural authorities who can't actually deal with this problem. And so bad news, Christchurch residents and ratepayers, you get to pay for that as well. Well, no, I'm sorry, that's not okay. The cost of actually fixing the drinking water throughout New Zealand, as I understand it, is about the cost of Transmission Gully. So the government actually needs to decide which is more important, water or roading. And so I don't think it's fair for them to say, Christchurch City ratepayers, you've just fixed your own water at quite major cost, and now, good news, you get to fix Kaikoura, West Coast, Nelson, Marlborough, Hurunui, Selwyn, Waimak as well, who we know have major problems. So I think we need to be very clear about this, and I know this is only part of the water issue, but there's so many parts of it at the moment. I just want to focus on this one. And I think we need to make it absolutely clear to the Department of Internal Affairs that they need to start looking for other alternatives. One simple one would be that they could actually take the GST on rates, which I don't even think is, I think it's marginally legal, and actually apply that to sorting out water, stormwater and wastewater throughout the country. But they have not considered those options. They've only considered these sort of options. So I think we need to be very clear up front that we're standing up for the people of Christchurch in terms of what we're prepared to pay and what we're prepared to do, and just so that there's no ambiguity about it whatsoever.
Thank you. Glenn.
Thank you. I support Vicky's comments wholeheartedly. Thank you, Helen, for your and team for your update. And in the recommendation where it talks about best endeavours, undertaking that work there, I was at the minister's, or attended the minister's speech rather, at the LGNZ conference. She said many things, one of which was any solution must fit our context. She said that herself in the context of having been to the UK, coming back here, but in New Zealand, she didn't specify whether it was a New Zealand-wide or local context, but one thing about our context is that we're big on is self-determination, which Vicky has just touched on, and to me that extends to every TA in the country. So context for me is the question with regard to our alpine-fed water, our very good testing regime. I had a conversation with a long-standing councillor of 8 terms, 24 years. Did you ever have any outbreaks? He said the worst, I think we had a mouse somewhere in the system in Riccarton, but it wasn't a big drama, it was quickly overcome. So we haven't had any health outbreaks from our water system. We've had the odd E. coli transgression. One thing we do have in terms of context too is a good functional relationship with our regional council. One of the factors identified in the Havelock North inquiries that sat behind the outbreak up there, and the fact that it could have been prevented if some of those relationships were better and they've been more proactive. For me, this is looming larger than it's about us being or becoming even more risk averse as a country. Is it about chlorinating the water, or is it about becoming more risk averse? So I'm fully behind what Vicky is putting forward today. I pick up Raf's point that something changed between August and December, but it wasn't the water, it was the goalposts on wheels, and they started shifting out of everyone's reach. I'm looking forward with my colleagues to becoming chlorine free again. I'd like to thank Helen again for all the work that her and the staff are doing.
Thank you. Dion and then Pauline. Dion.
I just wanted to echo what was said by Councillor Buck as well. My real concern, and I'll come back to the concern that I have, I just wanted to say thank you to the work that is being done as well, echoing the words Glenn was saying. And I think we should be celebrating some of the work that's happened and been accelerated, because it is pretty difficult from some of these reports, if you read them, how complex some of the work is. But I am concerned that the goalposts will continue to move. And I am concerned that in this report we have 2 paragraphs that actually talk about specifically what's going to happen next, and we have no control over that under the work we're doing at the moment. So my concern is that we're doing all this work at the moment, and actually the goalposts will further change. And then the goalposts will further change when we have to start paying for, or the public starts having to pay for work that somebody independent tells us to do. And then the city ratepayers and right throughout the whole country don't actually have any control over that. And that's a big concern, and which is why I support the additional amendment that's been put forward, because we do need to say that people who pay this work to be done actually should have some sort of say in this, because it is going to cost a lot of money, it is going to be difficult, and we do have good different circumstances here around the supply of our water, which comes from under the ground. I mean, I find it ridiculous how much water, you know, and on the west coast they get 6 metres of water a year. You could just open your mouth when it rains and you could get all the water you want, but they'll be put under the same rules and regulations that we do here and other places. I mean, you could just go down to a river, get some water and drink it. Are they going to start sort of regulating rivers? So I mean, it's going to be a very interesting time moving forward, but thank you for the work that you have done. And I do think that moving forward we are going to, as a council, have to have conversations, because in this report it does explicitly say that that 12-month time frame in the January resolution will probably not be able to be met. So I think we are going to need to have some conversation very soon about how we manage that and what we actually do and what we say to our communities.
Pauline and then Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that we're going to meet the deadline come hell or high water. Helen Highwater. I'd also like to congratulate Helen on this amazing report, and as Dion has said, it's incredibly complex. We've been all over this for many months now, and it's still very difficult to get your head around the many facets of this situation, and it's ever changing along with those goalposts. But look, basically, we've chosen, Christchurch Council has chosen to be proactive, and we've jumped in our upgrading program in our response to the learnings from Havelock North. So we've chosen to treat this as a learning situation, and I think it's big ups for that. We've opted to spend millions and millions of dollars. None of that is being wasted, no matter what happens in the future. So it's a very fine balancing act, knowing where and how to spend that money, and congratulations again for handling that very well. And we know that by the end of this month, 24% of our water will have no chlorine in it. I mean, that's fantastic. And a reduction of the dose by half, which is awesome. We're also looking at, we're running a parallel program with short term to get that chlorine out, and a long term to ensure that our infrastructure is robust and best practice. And I love what you said, Helen, about we're planning and we're doing at the same time. We see the report on the Dutch practices, which are being hailed as best practice. If we follow down that path, which I hope that we do, we could be facing some increased costs for delivery. But I certainly will not be supporting any government mandate for Christchurch to be financially supporting other TAs and their affordability of delivery and upgrading their three waters. We're doing all we can ourselves, spending millions of dollars to assure ourselves and our residents that we believe our systems are secure. And the government should and could look for other ways to support our surrounding TAs rather than leaning on us to support them. We won't be the financial winners out of that one, and we do risk losing control of our water. We've had the earthquakes, floods, the fire, and now the chlorination, all costing millions, if not billions, of our ratepayer dollars. This is significant for Christchurch, and our water is our #1 priority. And I still believe that because we're blessed with our good, pure groundwater, not everyone has the opportunity to have groundwater to drink. A lot of places have to drink surface water, which is far riskier, and sometimes recycled and treated water. So we are special. And also we're special because we have the expertise and the will to demonstrate the safety of our drinking water. And we do need to drill down into that, excuse the pun, into that term public ownership. What does that really mean, and what are the risks that belie that? So Christchurch and this council, I believe, is ready to stand firm and protect our pure resource of our deep aquifer drinking water, and to be able to access that in its pure state, untreated. And it is frustrating for us waiting for the government reports and announcements and requirements, and it is having an impact on our own planning. However, I acknowledge again and commend Helen and her team for managing this, and to plan and do at the same time, and ensuring that the money we're spending is well spent and not compromised in the future. And to address Aaron's issue about our high water consumption, we do have to remind ourselves that we are the Garden City, and we do make a lot of beer, and we do drink more beer in the summer. Therefore, it is why we do use more water in the summer. So the conservation call for residents will be a very interesting one. If it's gardeners, they need to start now by looking at mulching, so you don't need so much water. So we need to get onto that pronto. So I will also be supporting the additional amendment with the substantive. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've got Sarah, Aaron and Phil. Sarah.
Thank you. And I completely agree that it's unacceptable that our water supply would be amalgamated with other regions, and disingenuous to say that it would be publicly owned when it's clear that it wouldn't be democratically governed. But right here, right now in Christchurch, I have a real issue with the amount of money and time and staff resources being spent on the temporary chlorination for such a short time frame, when it's clear that there's been no measurable public health benefit for that, and when those many millions of dollars could have been spent instead, and that time and energy focused on actually repairing the infrastructure that needed it to start with. I think that's would have been a much better place for our time and energy and staff resources and ratepayers' money to be spent, would have been to getting straight into that work rather than spending months looking at how to temporary chlorinate when much of it has only been used for such a short amount of time. We need to get the chlorine out of our water. There has been no increased public health risk. Nothing had changed. We need to spend that money on getting our infrastructure up to standard, not just good enough to get rid of the chlorine, but we need it to be good enough to meet any new standards that the government has, and that includes our reticulation system, which is a key component. Havelock North was not about wellheads, it was about the aquifer, and we completely overreacted.
Aaron and then Phil. Aaron.
Cool. I'd firstly like to thank and congratulate the Crusaders for winning on the weekend, even though they were drinking chlorinated water. And just to clarify one thing, beer takes 61 to 180 litres of water to make 1 litre of beer, so that could mean that everyone in Christchurch is drinking approximately 5 litres of beer a day in summer. Just saying, that's Ireland. I just want to raise one point based on the addition that's been made, and that is around the minister that is leading the charge on this, or is in charge of this, around water, having visited the UK, and the UK has one controlling authority for water across the whole country, so not a great model in my book, and they chlorinate across the whole country and England, so not the best model to look at. I'd be a lot happier if she went to the Netherlands. And then finally, just that people should get a vote. If there is going to be permanent chlorination to any parts of New Zealand that don't already have it, the people, the public in those areas should get to vote. Otherwise, there is no mandate to permanently chlorinate their water, I believe, in a democracy. It's such a massive change to our country and our way of life, especially in this city, that the people should get a vote, not a consultation.
Thank you. Phil.
Thank you. I'm going to support the amendments, the additional recommendations there. I think it is important to send a signal to the DIA and to government that, in fact, a future company approach just isn't on. Clearly, that there is an indication around that it would remain in public ownership, and this government, I'm sure, would intend to do that. It doesn't mean that something that would be in public ownership in the future by way of an amalgamated authority would not be privatised later on by another government. So, however, I think that the important parts to this report too are that the developing information which we have received in terms of the different treatments that are going to be available, and that's what's been really valuable for us as a council, and we're going to get further advice too around some of the other treatments, and like clearly that I'll be certainly very interested, as I indicated, to look at the ultraviolet treatment and how effective and cost effective that will be. I think it's clear from this report that in fact, chlorine isn't the only tool in the toolbox. It's one barrier. It isn't totally effective, and so we are going to have to look at other options, and they will come to us. So, but I think it is fair at this stage to flag that our opposition to future water companies and having to pay for the costs for wider regions, when in fact our council are currently paying a huge amount of our capital project funding, as Vicky pointed out.
Tim and then Mike.
Thank you very much. I will absolutely support Vicky's amendment. I think it's a very good addition. But first of all, I'd like to thank Helen and Dave and their team for the work that they've done this report. But I guess that the key thing here is this city has been delivering clean drinking water to its residents well before we were required to add chlorine and change the wellheads and do other things to that. So I do want to congratulate our team and our staff for doing that for many, many years. With regards to the slide show that was the Three Waters review, which was the New Zealand Government and Internal Affairs, on page 28, requires answering some tough questions. Some of these questions are: how do we ensure communities and visitors have access to safe and affordable drinking water? We were actually doing that before we were lumbered with the cost of chlorination. How much will it cost to meet national directions and community aspirations for fresh water? Again, we were doing that. You could argue that it's been expensive, that it's over a third of our rates going to the Three Waters, but water is absolutely crucial. The other part of that question, how do we meet national directions? Well, that's costing our ratepayers a fortune at the moment, but they are two very different things. How do we meet increasing community expectations relating to drinking water? Well, the expectation of drinking water from our ratepayers was it's clean and safe and obviously drinkable. We were meeting those. We've been meeting those for many, many years, and our staff's testing regime is well and truly above what was required by the national standard leading into this. So how can you raise an expectation when it is a really simple expectation of clean and safe drinking water? The other question, how can communities with small or declining rate space fund renewals of ageing infrastructure? And this is around drinking water. That's not a question for the ratepayers of Christchurch, who are being stretched at 5.5% of rates at the moment. That is a question that those communities must ask their elected members and their officials and then government. That's not a question for the ratepayers of Christchurch. So as I said, I will be absolutely supporting this, and I hope this is going to send a very clear message to those in internal affairs in the government. Thank you.
Okay, and finally coming to Mike.
Thank you. While I voted against chlorinating our water back in January, I'd like to acknowledge the work the staff has done to try and get our water back to being untreated as quickly as possible. You know, it's not surprising, but it is, I guess, disappointing to hear that there's actually been no public health benefit from the temporary chlorination of our drinking water, and it has come at great expense. At a time where, you know, we see what's happening with central government, where they're heading, all our money needs to be put in to our drinking water infrastructure to make sure that we do get an exemption. You know, the alarm bells have been ringing for some time with what's happening centrally, and those bells are getting louder and louder. It's absolutely shocking to see the prospect that the ratepayers of Christchurch may have to start being responsible for other regions around the South Island. It's absolutely abhorrent, and I will oppose it, and I support this resolution.
Thank you. Yanni's indicated that he'd like to speak to this as well. Yanni.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just had a question for the mover and the seconder, just based on the report that we've got. I really strongly support the amendment, was happy to third it, but I do wonder whether we should be also directing this to the Merrill Forum and to Local Government New Zealand, and I just wondered whether we could include those two parties to it.
So we just add in some wording that reflects that? Yep, thank you.
That'd be great. And if I'll just talk to the amendment and the substantive at the same time.
What I'm going to do is just put, I mean, it was moved by Vicky, seconded by Dee on the whole lot, so I'm just going to put it as one motion.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. So just in regards to the amendment first, and it's one resolution, but the amendment that was put forward as part of that, I do think it is really important to point out that, you know, this has been, as others have said, this has been a response to the Havelock North inquiry, and in some ways it has felt like it's been forced on us. But I think one of the points that the Mayor made in the previous debate, which I had a lot of sympathy for, was the fact that because we made the decision to put chlorine temporarily into our water, we are the ones that now have the decision about when we wish to remove it. And I think that's a really important point. If we've been forced to do it by the medical officer of health, then that would have, as I understand it, been largely out of our control, and we could have been facing possibly a lot longer time frame for when we get to make get to remove chlorine from our water. So I think, you know, a number of councillors have referred to in the debate that this was forced on us. I think actually we did make the decision ourselves based on, you know, it was a pretty limited choice, but the medical officer of health had indicated that they would serve notice on us if we didn't make that decision. But I think there has been some advantages to us making that decision, and that we get to control when we remove chlorine from our water, and then we see possibly what the consequences are. In regards to the amendment, it's really important that although there's been a lot of reference to Havelock North Inquiry, this started well before then. There's a move in New Zealand to basically do the same thing to water that was done to electricity. In fact, the Local Government New Zealand Funding Review Discussion document, I believe it was from 2015, and I quote it, says that basically examples in New Zealand of water, wastewater and waste management being provided under corporate structures, but these institutional structures have not been adopted uniformly across councils. And it goes on to say that they believe that public utility models mean there's clear separation between policy and regulatory functions and service delivery, and that model contrasts with the more traditional models of service delivery within local authorities, which tend to compromise effective service delivery through insufficient charges, soft budget constraints, weak efficiency incentives, and low accountability. And then it goes on to say that the gains for clearer accountability for service delivery and performance of the utility drives cost savings and improvements in service quality, and that those gains have been extensively documented following the corporatisation of the former electricity departments and power boards. So what we can see is from 2015, and I think even earlier, there's a move to privatise and corporatise water supply. It's a gold rush, and I think what's playing out in terms of Havelock North has been, that's really served as ammunition to further that aggressive charge towards privatising and corporatising our water. And for anyone to think that the electricity reforms have had any benefit for local people, local consumers, when we've seen costs go through the roof, we've seen huge chief executive pay packets on what is effectively monopolies delivering a basic service to people that should be a fundamental right. So I think we should be really concerned, and we need to make sure and be as proactive as possible in making our opposition to this known. And just finally, I do want to commend the staff for the work they've done around the wellheads and the pump stations, but you know, I do think we're missing the big strategic piece of work around what we do in terms of water supply. We have a water supply strategy. Water conservation programs were supposed to be part of that. I'm not sure that they've really been funded adequately. They seem to be a soft touch in terms of the budget cuts. And so what we see through the LTP and the annual plan is that, you know, water conservation measures are not adopted in terms of our strategy because it's something that is not seen as a budget priority. Now we're in a situation where we're having to go back and really start ramping up those sorts of campaigns again. And personally, I think we need to urgently review that water supply strategy. The fact that we haven't reviewed it in 10 years, I think is a concern, particularly post-earthquake, where we want to have a greater resilience in our community. So I welcome the report today. Very happy to support the amendment. It's not a pleasant position for us to be in as a city, but the sooner we progress, the sooner we can take chlorine out of our water. Thank you.
Thank you. Raf.
I think just one thing I want to make clear around the chlorination is that it was a proactive move from council. We only did it because we had the medical officer of health breathing down our necks. We didn't have a concern about the water supply. It was a strategic decision knowing that if we did this for 12 months, we could address any particular wellheads that were of concern. But we were very clear we were only going to do this for 12 months. And I think the one thing missing in this report is that fact. There's an assumption, actually, that we may continue the chlorination beyond 12 months. I certainly don't hold that position. I'm not sure what the council's view is, but I think we need to actually have that in the conversation and not just assume we're going to move to conservation or switching off different pump stations. It's good work to be doing. You know, the wellheads do need to be the best they can be, and it's difficult to talk about that because we haven't had the report back yet, the Robertson report, so it's difficult to know what the situation was that led to some of these issues. So I support the work that is being done, but I do want to make clear that I don't support chlorinating the water supply past next January. In terms of the amendment, I'm pretty agnostic about that. That's, you know, I prefer to see a proposal before I make a decision on it, but I'm happy to support it today.
So just to wrap up, I mean, I'd certainly like to thank staff for what's a very detailed report and what clearly is a very large volume of work that's going on to lead to the outcomes that we've talked about this morning. Maximising the delivery of untreated water. It's great to see the amount of chlorine in the water being reduced and the amount of unchlorinated water coming into the network also been reduced and planned to be further reduced. Listening to the numbers, it's clear that this is a major programme of work. And I'm pleased to see that you are doing everything that you possibly can to look at different ways of speeding up the work programme with a clear focus on reducing and then removing the chlorine from the water supply as soon as possible. I guess these are exactly the conversations that we'd hope to be having, looking at all of the different ways that we could look at reducing and removing chlorine. And I'd reiterate the point that's been made. The original council resolution allows for chlorination of the water for 12 months. I'm pretty confident that we would not be looking at extending that 12-month chlorination period. Certainly my view is the chlorine was in there for 12 months. We do what we need to do within the 12 months and then the chlorine comes out. I'm reasonably confident that that would be the view that we would take at that time, and therefore that's the context in which we're working. But we certainly look forward to the upcoming reports which have been signalled this morning. The UV treatment is certainly an area of interest and could well be quite a large part of the solution to all of this. And again, it's good that you're looking at all different ways of dealing with this and not just going straight to continued chlorination as the way that we need to deal with what we're looking at here. Now, on the additional resolutions that have been put by Vicky, seconded by Dion, ownership of the water supply is something that has been talked about, you know, broadly for some time, and Yanni made the point that this conversation really predates Havelock North. And yeah, wrapping water up in a CCO or some other body which isn't necessarily governed by democratically elected people. Current government has got a commitment that water supply under whatever model would remain in public ownership. But of course, once you've created a CCO or some other vehicle, it's very easy under a different set of policies from a government which may not share that view, for that CCO then to be subject to privatisation, which would then see control of the water supply further removed from the people. And of course, ownership of water is something that I imagine would form quite a big part of that debate as well, particularly in New Zealand with the particular constitutional arrangements, the Treaty of Waitangi and so on that we've got here. We're very familiar as a territorial authority of what the cost of assuming the networks and the infrastructure of a small rural authority or small rural authorities would look like. There's significant contribution from Christchurch City Council into wastewater schemes in particular at the moment on Banks Peninsula. And like a number of other small rural authorities who have either chosen to underinvest or probably more likely haven't had the ability because of small populations to adequately invest in those water supply, wastewater, stormwater infrastructures, the city as a whole, with Banks Peninsula included, of course is now bearing the cost of wastewater improvements for Littleton Harbour, wastewater improvements for Akaroa Harbour. And I think it would be untenable for the people of the city to be expected to pay for those sort of infrastructure improvements across the whole of the north of the South Island or the whole of Canterbury or whatever it may be. So I'm also supportive of the additional resolutions that have been put as a result of the discussions that we've had today. We're in a position where we've got some significant expense as a city in dealing with what we need to do ourselves to look after our own residents within Christchurch City and Banks Peninsula, to have a further burden put onto us because of needing to look to support other rural authorities with small populations, and the lack of ability to pay for what we know is expensive infrastructure certainly isn't something that I would support. So I'm certainly pleased to support all of these resolutions today. So I'll put the Pauline.
Clarification, January's not the date. We didn't chlorinate till April, May.
All right, so I will now put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? That's carried. Thank you. And thanks to staff for detailed answers to questions and a detailed report. We'll now break for morning tea. It's 11.